Legends say sometime in the 1950s, Don Julian Santana Barrera would leave his family and move to a deserted island and start hanging dolls to appease the spirit of a young girl who he had seen drown there earlier. He believed the dolls were possessed by the spirit of the girl and other lost young spirits. Now, what if I told you this story was completely made up? Hey, you freaks and geeks, welcome to the Lion Kingdom. I'm the Lion King, and today I want to talk about the Island of Dolls, or as I like to call it, the Island of Lies. So, I love ghost stories, hauntings, tales of cursed objects, all that stuff, and I've been considering covering one or two on the channel. Maybe the Hope Diamond, maybe the Frozen Yeti Curse, or even the Black Orlog. But one that comes up everywhere you look is the Island of Dolls, a small human-made island off Laguna de Tequila, or Tequila Lagoon in English. Located in the channels of Chalcomico. Now, I'm not going to look up how to pronounce these. You're going to have to suffer through it with me. Hopefully you find some understanding from me. Now, just south of the center of Mexico City, something stood out to me as super strange. So, I know everyone talks about the island, but they usually tell the same old story, leaving out any background knowledge about Don Julian or about the girl or her family or other residents of the area or anything like that, how it might have impacted them or something like that. The stories even state that Don Julian had left his wife and child, and there's never any information about them stated or anything. So I thought it might be interesting to get some information on these background things that nobody really talks about. But what I came up with was the same story over and over again with minor alterations. And just in case you don't know the story, here's a brief rundown of the most well-known version of the story that everyone tells. In 1945, Don Julian would suddenly leave his wife and son, saying he had to go to this island and live alone, claiming that while out fishing one day on the shore, he would see a couple of little girls coming down to the canal to play, sisters by the looks of it. And while swimming, the current was too strong and one of the girls drowned. The next day, a doll he assumed belonged to the little girl would wash up on the island. Don Julian taking the doll and hanging it up to appease the spirit of the little girl. But soon he would be haunted by more and more spirits, or in some stories, it's the same little girl spirit. She would just get angrier and angrier. So to appease the spirit of the girl, he would begin to collect more and more dolls. He would begin digging through trash and trading vegetables for more dolls around the town. People would bring dolls to him as offerings to stop local misfortunes and hauntings. And he would collect more than 5,000 dolls in 50 years, making it into the Guinness Book of World Records at some point, until he died of a mysterious heart attack in 2001 in the exact spot where either the girl drowned or where the doll had first washed up. Sources vary. In some stories, it's the exact same spot, which makes sense. So
crazy, scary, spooky, hilarious,
right? But what if I told you almost all of that was complete lies made up to attract tourists and make for good headlines and articles? And that every source that runs with this story does the true tale a disservice by never doing any further research on the subject. And as a matter of fact, most of the articles featuring the story are basically copy and paste with few details changed out here and there so you couldn't tell. One of the most interesting parts of ghost stories, at least to me, is seeing which parts of the story are true and which parts are made up and get changed over time. You know, seeing quotes from people who were actually there, getting different interviews from the family members who experienced it, or seeing, or them exposing the family members for what they went through, or, stuff like that, where they either, we completely agreed to make it up or something like that, or, it was terrifying. Every day I seen them at work, they were looking more and more disheveled and stuff like that. I always find it so interesting, and it's usually a plethora of that stuff, because when something like this is happening and reporters and news people start coming around, everyone wants to talk to them, even if it's just to get in on the hoax. Like, look at Skinwalker Ranch, for instance. Look at Skinwalker Ranch, or some of the other, examples I stated earlier were just minor misfortunes. Like, somebody will be in a car accident, everyone involved in that will get in and do interviews and talk about it and things like that. So imagine my complete annoyance when I go to research the family and find absolutely nothing on any wife or son or child of any kind anywhere except in the articles, which spit out the same notes back and forth. I thought maybe the family had gone into hiding, moved, or tried to stay anonymous, which happens from time to time. But usually you'll have private eyes or detectives and reporters go find them through any means and either leave the source anonymous or something like that, but they'll still get the statement. So I found it strange that there was absolutely nothing, but maybe they just completely cut themselves off and didn't want to be associated with the crazy guy selling vegetables for dolls to appease the little girl spirit. I understand, I guess. couldn't be me, but I understand. So I had questions about the little girl. Like, why were they playing in the canals alone in the first place? I couldn't really find anything about it being a spot where kids frequently played or it being a popular spot or anything like that. So I looked into little girls in the area drowning at the time and found absolutely nothing, which is super strange because it was the 1950s and that may seem like such a far off time, but they had reports, death reports, obituaries, and things like that. There would have been an investigation, some type of information on it, families doing interviews with the news or something. The girl's sisters and family would have had some type of statement somewhere, especially if the story of the man who tried to save their daughter or their sister blows up and becomes really popular and her spirit's still haunting him literally, and they literally do nothing. They never come back to him. They never speak to him about, their family member or anything. That's super odd. There wasn't even any stories that could be misconstrued with it, like little girls being saved or almost drowning or anything like that, or even little boys. There wasn't any real reports of any children drowning in this river at all that I could find, which I found to be odd in this case because there's usually a plethora of information on these types. Even if there's not a plethora, there's still, a bunch of different stories from the area that does reports. But in this case, they're all just BuzzFeed articles and things like that, listing it off. So I was already having a tough time with accepting the story. And the last straw came when I was looking into what exactly the island was used for and why it may have been abandoned. And again, it was just the same stories over and over at the time. But at least I could find something that at least explains why the area itself may have been abandoned or at least never inhabited in the first place. The chinampas are man-made canals built by the Aztecs for agricultural purposes such as farming and providing fresh water to nearby settlements. I was expecting to find some crazy stories about a whole bunch of Aztec deaths related to the canals or some incidents when they were doing some digging it up or logging or something like that, but nothing really stuck out to me other than a couple natural incidents that comes with, bodies of waters like this. Not even any real children drownings or things of that nature. Nothing really stuck out to me as cursed or anything, but I did find out why the island why the island at the time was completely abandoned. It was dealing with a massive water lily invasion which choked up the river and it made it difficult to traverse the area, which we'll come back to later. So the temperature would also drop to near freezing at night, and it was also a good distance from any other settlements, which makes me wonder, why would a little girl be swimming there with her sisters? Like, I'm pretty sure this one wasn't even like off the coast or anything. They say it's a good distance from any other settlements and it's alone. So why would there be a little girl swimming there? Why was he fishing there in the first place? And it's extremely difficult to get to in the first place. These are just questions that never get answered in any of the articles or headlines that usually, I was thinking I'd find some background information on. So I wasn't sure that I'd find any ghost tales, and I didn't. But what I did find is at least the closest version of the truth that I could confirm. So I'll be using a couple articles, and those articles are the Chinampa area of Chacomilco lost one of their characters, Don Julian, a man who spoke to God, and the mermaids with their dolls, by Marina Norandai, written April 21st, 2001, just 2 days after the passing of Don Julian. Another one called The Island of Dolls by the Museum of Mexico in 2005. And finally, The Lord of Dolls of Chacomilco died April 17, 2001 by Professor Sebastian Flores Arfin, who was one of the few people to interview Don Julian and who would actually feature in an episode of Ghost Hunters at one point. So buckle in, because here's the true story behind the island of wish-granting dolls and killer mermaids. Born on October 22nd, 1921, in one of the oldest neighborhoods of Chacomilco, La Asunción, at number 9 of the alley in Tlaxcalpan, raised at a young age to grow and sell vegetables in the downtown market. Because of the canals, local vegetable farmers were pretty common until around the 1940s, where the Green Revolution would come to Mexico, which saw a switch to modern technology and a growing support for commercialized farming, making it more and more difficult for urban farmers to succeed. Even still, every day Don Julian would be seen taking his wheelbarrow full of crops to the market. He would always be wearing his white breeches tied to his knees, wearing a jorongo, which is just those ponchos with the cool patterns that you'll always see tourists buying. Because of his small frame, the locals began to call him La Coquita, a local bird known for its small stature. Now, I'm not sure if it's supposed to be insulting or endearing, but anyway, after work every day, he would go to a local pub called the Pulqueria Los catesto, and have a pulque, a Mexican drink made from agave pulp whose origins predates even that of tequila and mezcal, and considered by some to be the true alcohol of the Mexican people. Anyway, due to the Green Revolution, the vegetable sales would begin to dry up, but Don Julian wouldn't care as long as he made enough for his daily pulque. He would always drink alone, pretty much never speak to anyone. Though friendly, he was known to be a pretty withdrawn and shy person, which is why people would find it so strange when he would start begging and loudly proclaiming the word of Jesus, which in the time was considered to be blasphemy if you weren't a priest or higher member of the church. So people sometimes would attack him in the streets or complain to the authorities. Then in the midst of this already strange behavior, he would begin collecting dolls from local trash cans, and in 1975, he would get up and just leave, telling his nephew Anastasio Santana, who was almost always with him, save for when he went to get his drink, he'd say, "I'm going to my chinampa. I'm already bothering the houses, commercials, asking for a penny for my pulque. To suffer here, I'd be better to suffer there." Though this is a rough translation, but either way, the sentiment was clear. He didn't want to bother the people. So he would leave to a chinampa that were apparently communally owned and live there alone, with his only company for years being his nephew and sister, who would be in charge of selling his vegetables and bringing his food. So I just want to state here, a lot of stories already say it's the 1950s, but he didn't leave to go to the chinampa to 1975. And I want to say, if there's a little girl that drowned there in that time, there would definitely be news and things of that nature on it, especially with how tight-knit this community seems to be, as you'll see later. I definitely believe that a little girl couldn't just drown there without anybody addressing it and things of that nature, which already, again, just more proof that the story is just trying to get as many clicks as possible, making it an old weather tale type of. That also means he didn't spend over 50 years collecting dolls. That meant he spent closer to about 25, 26 years collecting dolls. And he didn't even spend that entire time collecting dolls. Anyway, his home was a small hut made of reeds. He would farm and fish and hang dolls for years without anyone even noticing he had left Ashiron until 1991, when ecological rescue of Chacomilco to clean the water and clear the canals and stop the water lily plague that had been slowly choking the river, making it impassable for years. So with the waterways finally clearing up after years, so imagine everyone's surprise when they began to see hundreds of dolls in an area that no one was supposed to be living. Naturally, people began to wonder who did this and why. So reporters would go out, and whenever they showed up, Don Julian was kind but would turn them away and decline interviews, until one day he agreed to an interview with Sebastian Florin, one of his few friends. He was a young boy whose father owned the bar that Don Julian would frequent, so served him, and so Don Julian would welcome him as a friend years later, where he'd finally explain the dolls, which I think is one of the most fascinating parts of this story, because a ton of the articles treat it as he was proud to tell everybody that he thought the dolls were haunted, or how proud, or he'd always show them off and things of that nature. But that just simply wasn't true. When his nephew asked him about all the dolls hanging around, he told him that they'd simply washed up on the island one day and that he had no idea where they came from. And it wasn't until years later, after a few pulques with Sebastian, that he'd finally revealed that he collected dolls before he left and would hang them around as talismans to ward off evil spirits and bring him good crop. Because he was alone except for the wild animals, he would often carry them with him on nights when he was scared, which is just kind of sweet. This man living by himself would hear the dogs and the other wildlife get spooked and grab his dolls for protection, which according to his nephew wasn't even that strange, as his uncle was a deeply spiritual person who believed many strange things. And in these articles, after he left the city, there's no other mentions of him coming back to collect dolls or anything. So I believe he knew that he was leaving the city, so he collected as many dolls as he could, knowing he'd be alone in many nights and wanting things to be a little less creepy, at least by his standards. He wanted all the dolls around him, which I know for a lot of people wouldn't be as comforting, but to him it seemed to bring him peace and comfort. So with the floodgates open, many curious people would come to visit or try to speak with him. And while he was usually kind and hospitable, he would offer his guests some of his best foods or crops, and they would usually insist on paying or just leaving something behind for him for his kindness. And after a while, he would stop selling at the market altogether and would just make his living selling to passerbys or visitors of his small island. In these articles, I couldn't find anything about him trading vegetables for dolls or anything of that nature. But what I did see is that people passing the island or visiting would sometimes leave behind dolls as offerings to bring good fortune. So I believe that's where the rumor that he was trading things for dolls and things like that would come up. But it seems that after he left initially, he wouldn't collect any more dolls unless people brought them to him directly. Now, Don Julian did have a favorite doll named La Monica, or just the doll in English, But from what I could tell, it wasn't because he believed the doll to be haunted. What seemed to happen was this doll was his favorite because it was his largest, and he would often bring it with him most of the time. And I'm not sure if he believed it would grant wishes or if other people who just came to the island frequently and would notice that it moved around a lot believed this. So, according to the legend, people who visited the island frequently believed that the doll was special and that they could make wishes to the doll. And once granted, you were supposed to bring something back as a gift to the doll, usually garments or accessories. Don Julian, being the kind man he was, would often dress the doll in what people would bring for her. And somehow this just spiraled into the rumor that the little girl had possessed the doll and he feared her and would have to dress her up and, do things like that to appease the doll. And she was always moving. Now, a far less well-known fact that I think is just as interesting was that he had these little mules made of corn husk just hanging around, and I think that those have some type of significance, but I'm not too sure. I couldn't really find anything other than like I think they set them up at parties. If you know, can you let me know down below? But either way, he also had crosses made of Huito wood, which holds a bit of spiritual significance, being the national tree of Mexico, as well as apparently being sacred to the indigenous people of Mexico. It's also been known to represent longevity as well as being used in some ceremonies for purification. Another interesting thing that he would do is hang cutouts and photographs of political figures, delegates from Chacamilco, artists, students, and other people who are going to visit him in the future, which I think is just super fascinating. Again, because it's so poorly documented and nobody cared to keep a record of any of this stuff. They just wanted to tell ghost stories. I'm wondering, did any of the people that he thought would visit him actually visit him? And if they did, like, what did he do with the cutouts and things like that? But either way, he'd collect and display newspaper clippings that reporters would bring to him of himself. He was a genuinely kind man who lived a quiet and mostly simple life. He would farm and fish, and other than the occasional reporter, the only people he'd regularly have contact with were his sister and his nephew, his primary caretakers, who would help him with his meals and were also the ones who would go and sell his vegetables, as mentioned before. So, finally, we can get to Don Julian's death, which again I find so much more interesting than the stories that have been passed around. So, his nephew would describe it as a normal day, with them making water lily compost and Don Julian doing some fishing, as he always did. He was apparently focused on a fish that had gotten away from him twice before. With Don Julian blaming the mermaids, yes, that's right, he didn't necessarily believe the island was haunted by ghosts, but he did believe that the island was haunted by mermaids. Which, come on, when did we get modern day mermaids? When was the last time we had mermaids in the 90s? Can somebody tell me a mermaid story from the 90s? It's not like we get like pirates telling these stories anymore. People just had to have their ghost doll. Anyway, he did believe that there were mermaids who would occasionally take his fish or try to take him down, and he'd have to sing to them to prevent them. It's almost funny that no articles ever mention this really. They'll say that there were sirens and things like that, but according to a couple of the articles I could find before it became so dramatized, the mermaids were his main focus. They were the things that he'd really talk about frequently. Anyway, Don Julian would soon call his nephew over to show him a fish that was about 4 or 5 kilos in Mexican, or in American, that's about 8 to 11 pounds. He would say to his nephew, "I already have it, he who had escaped me." And he would tell him he must sing now because the mermaids were trying to take him. They were upset that he took their fish. He'd tell his nephew to be careful. The nephew would go to gather some milk, and when he'd return, he'd see his uncle had drowned in the same spot he said the mermaids were calling to him from. But according to the nephew, the family wasn't even that sad because he had passed in a place that he loved so much with the dolls and the mermaids that he loved to talk about. And after a small ceremony at his sister's house, he would be taken to the church in the neighborhood where he was born and have a short mass. And afterwards, he would be paraded through the streets of the city to his family's crypt where he was laid to rest. And many turned up and considered him to be a friend. Many of his family members were seen there having emotional. No, 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 you gotta go. Hi, baby. Hi, baby. No, you gotta get out. Daddy's recording. Okay. Sorry if you hear any of that. That's my kids. Anyway, many family members seem to be having emotional outbreaks, with Maridine Naradini writing, "The island was left alone without Don Julian. No one comes to receive the visitors anymore, save for 4 skinny dogs. Chinampa lost one of its characters, someone who lived most of his life alone as a hermit. He never married, never had children, nor was he known to have any affair. He lived in the mystery of solitude, immersed in the enigmas of the legend of Chacamilco, and surrounded by the reeds, birds, and fish, accompanied by his dolls and poke, showing just how much he meant to this small community." I feel like the real story, especially because I don't think there's any other stories in the 90s of mermaids, especially with a confirmed death. Come on, people, get on that. You put true story, have a mermaid romance. Anyway, I feel like the real story is so much cooler than generic haunted dolls and little girls. As far as I could tell, the family would leave the island mostly as a tourist destination until the story became more popular and they would start hosting tours, allowing guests to explore the huts and such. But the earliest story about a little girl dying and haunting a doll appears to be gone from the internet.
I hate you. I say that not out of anger, but simply as a fact. It's 67 degrees outside, and I hate you.
Maybe it started with the family trying to buzz up attraction for tourism, which if that's the case, I'm not as mad, but it like it just does such a real disservice to the actual life of Don Julian, whose last words were about actual mermaids coming to take him and then drowning right after that in the same spot. I think that's super interesting, and his backstory gets left off. The fact that Lamonica wasn't a Annabelle style doll, but a wish granting doll that people came for good things, not it just does a disservice to his legacy to make him seem so dark and haunted, like he was so lonely and all these things, and he left his wife and son so callously. But that's just not true. He never married by choice, and he was a hermit by choice. He wasn't haunted by the death of a little girl or anything. He loved his community, even if not fully welcomed by them. He still had plenty of company over the years. He was a relatively happy man who certainly may have been mentally unwell, but that didn't stop him from living a full, happy life. And again, the article even states that he loved to talk about mermaids to anyone who would listen on the island. He'd farm and fish and greet those who came to the island with nothing but hospitality and kindness. And I'm just gonna keep saying this. Cutting someone's true story down to just a catchy headline and a quick article does a disservice to such a fascinating life that this man lived. It makes it so much harder to find real information about him because everywhere I look it's just the same copy and paste articles with no further information. And these just make it harder to research. And I just wanted to make sure that I could tell the actual story because again, mermaids in the 90s killing someone is just so much more fascinating. And whoever the first journalist was that made up this headline and did no further research, I just want to say,
your intellect is as weak as your dollar. Failure is your destiny. You disrespect yourself and your nation. You are made of stupid.
And
Your mom's a hoe.
that ends our tale of Ghost Girls and Polka. And if you enjoyed this, like will really go a long way, and a comment means a lot. It helps me improve. And if you know something I don't, please leave a comment. I'm coming to learn. You guys in the comments usually have a lot of fascinating details on exactly what I'm talking about, and you usually know more about me. And at some point, if I get enough comments with this type of information, I'll definitely make like another video with just all the comments and the cool information I learned after starting this channel. Anyway, it'd be super cool if you subscribe because I've got plenty of great ideas and videos coming up. I do just want to apologize for the long wait time on this video. I do have other stuff to do. I work a full-time job. I've got 3 kids, and it takes a lot of time to make these videos, edit, and do everything by myself. Which brings me around to my next point. I'm going to be starting a Patreon for anyone who wants to show their support on these videos. They do take a lot of work and a lot of time. If you want to show your support and help me take a few less hours at work, that would be great. I'll also be eventually I'm going to be getting an actual camera because right now I'm just using my phone. I'll get an actual microphone because as you can see, this is just a cheap little Walmart one. I'd like to get a real. I'll probably use the money to go on and pay for some actual editing software because right now I'm just using the free version so I can only do basic edits and things of that nature. I will be uploading some content to the Patreon. I haven't quite figured out what it's going to be, but I'm going to do something, whether it's going to be shorter videos that aren't quite as long as I'd like my main channel videos to be or something like that. Maybe just side information that I figured out. Don't worry, I'll figure out something to put up on the Patreon. And if you stuck around all the way to the end, I just want to say thank you. See what happens when you stick around to the end? You get extra thank you. Sucker. You didn't know the extra thank you was counterfeit. Oh, you're still here. Hey, how much of that did you hear? Come here.